The Schism of 1552 was an important event in the history of the Church of the East. It divided the Church into two factions, of which one entered into communion with Rome, becoming part of the Catholic Church at this time, and the other remained independent until the 1800s. Although the Eliya line, which emerged as a result of this schism, did eventually enter into communion with Rome, various spiritual Christian sects with their origins in the Church of the East emerged as a result of this schism. Ironically, the Shimon line, whose entry into full communion with Rome caused this schism, in fact became independent again by the 1600s. The circumstances of the 1552 schism were controversial at the time and have been disputed ever since. Summary of events. Around the middle of the 15th century, the Patriarch Shimon IV made the patriarchal succession hereditary, normally from uncle to nephew. This practice, which tended to result in a shortage of eligible heirs, eventually led to a schism in the Church of the East. The Patriarch Shimon VII caused great offense at the beginning of his reign by designating his 12-year-old nephew Nanisho as his successor, presumably because no older relatives were available. Several years later, probably because Nanisho had died in the interim, he designated as successor his 15-year-old brother Eliya, the future Patriarch Eliya VII. Besides making these two provocative appointments, he was also accused by his opponents of permitting concubinage, selling clerical posts and living intemperately. By 1552, Shimon VII had become so unpopular that his opponents rebelled against his authority. The rebels, principally from the East.It and Salmis districts, elected as patriarch a monk named Shimon Ad Yohanan Sulaka, the leader of Rabban Hormizd monastery near Alkosh. Unfortunately, no bishop of metropolitan rank was available to consecrate him, as canonically required. Franciscan missionaries were already at work among the Nestorians as well, and they legitimized the position by persuading Sulaka's supporters and getting him consecrated by Pope Julius III. Sulaka went to Rome to put his case in person. At Rome he made a satisfactory Catholic profession of faith and presented a letter, drafted by his supporters in Mosul, which set out his claims to be recognized as patriarch. On the 9th of April 1553, having satisfied the Vatican that he was a good Catholic, Sulaka was consecrated bishop and archbishop in the Basilica of St. Peter. On the 28th of April he was recognized as Patriarch of Mosul by Pope Julius III in the bull Divina Disponente Clementia, and received the pallium from the Pope's hands at a secret consistory in the Vatican. These events, which marked the birth of the Chaldean Catholic Church, created a permanent schism in the Church of the East. Sulaka returned to Mesopotamia towards the end of the same year. In December 1553, he obtained documents from the Ottoman authorities recognizing him as an independent Chaldean patriarch, and in 1554, during a stay of 5 months in Amid, consecrated 5 metropolitan bishops. Shimon VII responded by consecrating 2 more underage members of the patriarchal family as metropolitans for Nisibis and Gazata. He also won over the governor of Ahmadiyya, who invited Sulaka to Ahmadiyya, imprisoned him for 4 months, and put him to death in January 1555. The disputed circumstances of Sulaka's election. There are 2 very different and contradictory traditions as to the circumstances of Sulaka's election. according to one version of events, which derives from a letter of Andrew Macius and is also reflected in the Vatican's consistorial act of April 1553. The schism of 1552 was precipitated by the death of the Patriarch Shimon bar Mamad at Gazata in 1551, and by the subsequent consecration of an 8-year-old boy, Shimon Dena, as his successor. Sulaka was thereupon elected by a party in the church which disapproved of the principle of hereditary succession. Shimon Dena and Sulaka then lived for 2 years as rival patriarchs, until Shimon Dena encompassed Sulaka's death in 1555, dying himself in 1558. This tradition sought to legitimize Sulaka's election to Pope Julius III and his cardinals, by presenting it as a return to the elective principle. This version of events has been repeated in several subsequent histories, including Asamanes to Catholicize Seu Patriarchus Chaldeo Romain Nestorianem and Becetti's Historia degli Ultimi Quattro Secoli della Chiesa. It has also been accepted by several modern scholars of the Church of the East, including the Chaldean deacon Joseph Tafigi in 1913 and Cardinal Eugene Tisserant in 1931. More recently, it was accepted by Jean Maurice V.E., a scholar of particular eminence in this field. V.E.'s Puran Oriens Christianus Novus, which lists all known patriarchs and bishops of the East and West Syrian churches, duly lists the patriarchs Simon Seven bar Mamad and Simon Dena, according to another version of events, deriving from the testimony of the second Chaldean patriarch Abdasho IV Maron and confirmed by a letter of January 1555 by the papal nuncio, Ambrose Buttigieg. Sulaka was consecrated during a rebellion against the reigning patriarch Shimon VII Nisho YHB. The rebellion was prompted by Shimon's dreadful conduct in general, and by his consecration of 2 underage metropolitans in particular. This tradition sought to legitimize Sulaka's election to critics in the Church of the East, by presenting it as a justified revolt against a dissolute patriarch. The two versions of events cannot be reconciled, and give rise to the strong suspicion that Sulaka or his supporters lied to the Vatican in 1552 when they claimed that Sulaka had been elected in response to the consecration of the 8-year-old patriarch Shimon Dena after Bar Mama's death in 1551. In reality, Sulaka's election constituted an act of rebellion against Shimon VII Nisho YHB, who was still Patriarch of the Church of the East when Sulaka was consecrated at Rome in April 1553. Attention was first drawn to the contradictions in the relevant sources by J. M. Voste in 1931, but he did not pursue their implications. In an influential study by Joseph Haby in 1966, these implications were more fully explored. Haby's study concentrated on the contradictions between the surviving documentary evidence in the Vatican and an alternative version of events, preserved in the poems of Abdasho IV Maron, Sulaka's successor as Chaldean Patriarch, and he concluded that Sulaka was elected in 1552 in the course of a rebellion against the reigning Patriarch Shimon VII Nisho YHB. Haby focused purely on the literary sources, and did not consider a significant additional body of evidence available in the colophons of a number of 16th-century East Syrian manuscripts. The evidence from these colophons, deployed by David Wilmshurst in the Ecclesiastical Organization of the Church of the East 1318 to 1913, fully supported Haby's main contention, and also shed further light on the circumstances of Sulaka's election by identifying the two youthful metropolitans whose consecration precipitated the schism of 1552. Habby and Wilmshurst's conclusions were accepted by Helene Mura van den Berg in an important article published in Hugo in 1999. The Patriarchs of the Church of the East from the 15th to 18th centuries, and have not subsequently been challenged by scholars of the Church of the East. Disputes over history. The version of Andrew Macias. According to a letter of Andrew Macias, Sulaka was elected shortly after the death of the previous patriarch at Gazata in 1551, who was succeeded by his 8-year-old nephew Shimon, the only surviving male relative. According to Labour, who does not identify his source, Shimon was consecrated by Ninasho, the sole remaining metropolitan. Sulaka was thereupon elected by a party in the church which disapproved of the principle of hereditary succession, and Shimon and Sulaka lived for some years as rival patriarchs, until Shimon encompassed Sulaka's death in 1555, dying himself in 1558. This tradition is reflected in the language used in the consistorial act in the Vatican recognizing Sulaka as patriarch. After asserting that Sulaka's election followed the death of the patriarch Simon Mamard, the act continues as follows. About 100 years ago a patriarch tried to make his sacred office hereditary in his family, and every bishop, metropolitan and patriarch since has been a member of his family. The last patriarch likewise tried to designate as his successor his nephew, whom he had made a bishop when just a child of 8, but died before he could achieve his aim. The whole nation, priests and laymen alike, resolved to take this heaven-sent opportunity of ending the tyranny and restoring its old right of election. Problems with Macias's account. Despite the authority of the scholars who have followed Macias, there are grounds for rejecting his version of events. First, the only evidence is Macias's statement that a patriarch died at Gazata in 1551, and it is possible that he misunderstood the position. His letter drew on a letter written at Mosul in 1552 by Sulaka's supporters, which was taken to Rome by Sulaka. This letter, quoted in two slightly different versions by Semani and Van Gulik, does not mention the recent death of a patriarch. Instead, it states that the patriarch had tried to create a metropolitan from among his relatives. 100 years ago we had a patriarch who would only consecrate a metropolitan from among his own stock, clan and family, and his family has maintained that custom for the last 100 years. Now only one bishop is left from the family, and he has impudently tried to do the same as his predecessors, but we have refused to accept to proclaim him. Furthermore, by this period it had become customary for the patriarchs to be buried in the monastery of Rabban Hormizd, and there is no intermediate tomb between that of Shimon and that of a patriarch named Shimon who died in 1558. Finally, a number of poems on the life of Sulaka composed in the year following his death by his successor Abdasho IV Maron know nothing of the recent death of a patriarch and the succession of Shimon. In these poems, translated in 1931 by J. M. Voste, Sulaka and his supporters rebelled against a dissolute patriarch named Barmamad, a veteran in office and not a recently elected child. This patriarch remained in office after Sulaka's election, and was eventually able to encompass his death in 1555. He may therefore have been the feeble Catholicus Shimon, son of the deceased Mamar, whose ownership note has been preserved in a manuscript copied in 1482. The version of Abdasho IV Maron Abdasho's account, written close to the events it describes, and for a readership familiar with the circumstances of Sulaka's election, is to be preferred to the version which outsiders were encouraged to believe. Abdasho wrote both to justify Sulaka's irregular election and to rebut its critics. The emphasis of the poem showed that Sulaka's supporters were uneasy on 2 points. First, that they had rebelled against a reigning patriarch, and secondly, that they had gone outside the Church of the East and sought Sulaka's consecration at Rome. Abdasho dealt with the second point by stressing the lack of bishops available in Kurdistan, and giving a list of previous patriarchs who had been consecrated at Rome. The first and more important criticism he parried by citing biblical examples of the deposition of bad rulers, stressing Bahmama's unfitness for his position, and suggesting that he was as good as dead. When this Bahmama had estranged himself from the patriarchal throne, and might just as well have been dead as alive, the bounty of our Saviour chose an excellent monk of the monastery of Beth Qoqa named Sulaka, and created him Catholicus. A long passage in one of these poems lists a catalogue of Bahmama's offences. Observe and consider attentively, wise reader, how the justice of the Most High hurled down this impure Bahmama from his lofty throne, because his sins accumulated and his injustices multiplied. Justice justly manifested herself and rejected him like false coin. His outward behavior attests the inner man, and his actions declare that his end is near. He cares nothing for fasts, prayers, and liturgical vigils, but all his delight is in idleness and morning revels. His life is one long round of banquets of exotic dishes. He is a slave to his passion for good living and pleasure. He detests Sunday fasts, preferring instead to drink wine. Whatever he may say, his conduct makes it all too plain that he has no wish to judge the guilty. He is consumed by the love of money, the root of all evil, which has taken such deep root in his heart that it has driven out any virtuous feeling. He dearly loves gold and silver, and so he courts the wealthy, conferring the clerical order of his choice on anyone who gives him enough money. Although it is written that gold and silver should be valued no more than a shard of baked earth, he worships it as boldly and openly as a heathen. We have all seen how he has sold for money the gift of grace which was given freely by our Lord, and which by God's pleasure no worthy recipient has ever yet bought. In his insatiable greed he has taken the priesthood, which cannot be bought or sold, and put it on the market. He despised the doctors and disregarded their teachings, claiming that they were irrelevant and unnecessary. As though inviting the misfortune he richly deserves, he disobeyed the commandments of God, the ecclesiastical canons, and the statutes of the apostles. He ignored the teachings of St. Peter and despised the prohibitions of St. Paul. He set at nothing the acts of all the synods, and viciously broke every law. He trod underfoot the law of the Old Testament and ignored the teachings of the New. He loved iniquity, delighted in fraud, hated truth, and abhorred sincerity. He invented shameful stories against the mother of churches. He persecuted monasteries and churches, and looted houses and convents. Hating the good and loathing justice, he overthrew the temples and oratories of the saints and fathers. He made a mockery of the rituals of the churches, and overturned the clerical orders. It is impossible to express fully the wickedness of this perverse man. Many dioceses were left widowed, and he handed over their administration to laymen. He deposed and suspended many priests who had committed no fault. He irregularly ordained as a metropolitan a boy of 12, inviting excommunication from his bishops. Not content with that, he consecrated as a metropolitan another boy of only 15, as truthful and trustworthy witnesses will confirm. How many unjust betrothals, illicit marriages and irregular unions were contracted on his orders. He allowed one man to take 3 wives, an abominable crime which shocks the conscience of men and beasts alike. He let another man without either schooling or wit take 2 wives, in flagrant contravention of our teachings. A third man had his authority to marry the wife of his father's brother, a grave and horrible sin. A fourth was allowed to marry the wife of his mother's brother, a union which the lawgiver has specifically forbidden. A fifth, or also, with his approval, sinfully married his godmother, who should have been to him as a sister or an aunt. The evidence of Ambrose Buttigieg, confirmation of Abdishaw's version of events, was later provided by the Bishop Ambrose Buttigieg, a Maltese Dominican who accompanied Sulaka back to Mesopotamia in late 1553 as papal nuncio. On the 12th of January 1555, Buttigieg wrote to the Vatican to inform Pope Julius III that Shimon bar Mama was still alive and had just contrived Sulaka's murder. Your Holiness will be shocked to learn that, contrary to what Your Holiness, the Most Reverend Cardinals, and the rest of you were told, the old patriarch never died at all, and has recently murdered the said Simon Sulaka. Evidence from manuscript colophons, to have committed the catalogue of crimes imputed to him by Abdishaw IV Maron, the Patriarch Bar Mama must have held office for several years. According to the evidence from the dating formulas of manuscripts copied in the first half of the 16th century, the Patriarch Shimon I, who died on the 5th of August 1538, was succeeded by his brother Shimon VII Nisho YHB, who is first mentioned as a metropolitan and guardian of the throne as early as 1504, and who was first mentioned as patriarch in a colophon of 1539. He is clearly Abdishaw's Patriarch Bar Mama. According to Abdishaw, Bar Mama scandalized the faithful by consecrating 2 boys as metropolitans, one of 12 and the other of 15, and of handing over the administration of other dioceses to laymen, as Bar Mama would no doubt have consecrated other members of his family for these vacant dioceses if any had been available. It is likely that these 2 metropolitans were the only bishops he consecrated. Evidence from a number of manuscript colophons indicates that Shimon VII Nisho YHB did indeed make only 2 metropolitan appointments before the schism of 1552. In 1539, not long after his accession, he consecrated his nephew Nanasho Metropolitan of Mosul, and shortly afterwards designated him guardian of the throne. Nanasho is mentioned as Metropolitan of Mosul in a colophon of 1539, as Metropolitan in 1540, as Metropolitan and Natakersia in 1540/1, as the Patriarch's nephew and Natakersia in 1543, and as Metropolitan and Natakersia in 1545. 2 colophons of 1545 also mention Nanasho as Natakersia and Metropolitan of Gazata. He was probably transferred to Gazata not long beforehand because its previous bishop had died. A Metropolitan Gabriel of Gazata is mentioned in the colophons of 10 manuscripts copied between 1529 and 1542, the last of which was copied at Gazata on the 12th of November 1542. It is clear from these references that, besides holding successively the metropolitan appointments of Mosul and Gazata, Nanasho was also Natakersia as early as 1541 and as late as the 18th of October 1545. Between the 18th of October 1545 and 1550 he was replaced as Natakersia by his brother Eliya. In unknown circumstances, Eliya became patriarch in 1558, and is known from his tomb inscription in the monastery of Rabban Hormitz to have been consecrated a metropolitan 15 years earlier. In 1543, he is mentioned as Natakersia in colophons of 1550, May 1552 and June 1554. According to Abdasho, Bar-Mama invited the excommunication of his bishops with his earlier consecration. The consecration of Eliya as metropolitan in 1543 doubtless increased his unpopularity, but does not seem to have elicited an immediate reaction. Nanosho remained Natakursu for at least 2 years after Eliya's consecration, and the schism of 1552 was probably provoked by Eliya's designation as Natakursu, perhaps as late as 1550. The age of the two brothers at the time of the consecrations is not known, but they were both certainly young men. Eliya died in 1591, and his tomb inscription in the monastery of Rabban Hormizd mentions that he had been a metropolitan for 15 years and patriarch for 32 years. The colophon of a manuscript of 1562, copied 4 years after Eliya became patriarch, contains a prayer that God might uphold the youth of the patriarch and his brother the metropolitan Nanosho, and give them long life. For Nanosho and Eliya, consecrated in 1539 and 1543 respectively, to be described as youths in 1562, they must both have been consecrated at a young age, and were doubtless the two young metropolitans consecrated by Bar-Mama, at the ages of 12 and 15 respectively. If Nanosho was 12 when he was consecrated in 1539, he would have been 35 in 1562. Similarly, if Eliya was 15 when he was consecrated in 1543, he would have been 34 in 1562 and a respectable 63 at the time of his death in 1591.